Hey, what's up you guys? So I'm going to show you the sequence of stretches that I like to do before I do any Taekwondo training. All right, so after I've warmed up a little bit, I usually do some jumping jacks, and that's pretty decent, just getting the blood flowing. And when I'm ready to do some stretches, I almost always start off with this stretch right here. This is what I call a socket stretch, right? So I'm stretching my hip socket, or sometimes I'll call it a side kick stretch because it works pretty well for that as well. Things to keep in mind on this: back heel should be down on the ground. Do not raise it up. It's going to change what we're stretching. We're stretching right here on the inside. And now when I do this, I go into a dynamic stretch, right? If you're starting off your training, right, so after you warmed up and you're stretching prior to actually doing your training, dynamic stretching is the way to go. Not ballistic, there's a difference. So dynamic stretching is just moving through full range of motion, right? I can do a little bit of a bounce, but notice everything is slow and controlled. I'm not going super fast, right? I don't want to go super fast. And I'll just go into that full range of motion and then back out. Into that full range of motion and then back out. Trying to go a little bit further each time. Again, not shooting down to where I end up hurting myself. So I'll do that on one side and then the exact same thing on the other side. So feel free to do this along with me. Get a little bit of that stretch and warm up in. All right. So do this about 8 to 10 times going into it. Now the next thing I do is I rotate my back heel just like that. Now this is what I call a hip flexor stretch, right? That's what it is, right? Or a lunging hip stretch is what I'll typically call this one. So same thing, I can bounce down and come up. You should be feeling this right here, and you're stretching that hip flexor. So same thing, do this about 8 to 10 times. And then make sure you go and you do that other side. Again, make sure that that back heel is up when you're doing this, all right? And now you can do a little bit of a static stretch where you kind of hold it. But the problem with that is if you hold for too long before a training session, it's actually proven that you can diminish the amount of power they're actually able to generate whenever you're doing this. So if you're just doing it too long, right, you probably feel like your legs are kind of noodly afterwards. That's not the goal of stretching for a warm-up. You shouldn't feel noodly. You shouldn't feel overly stretched whenever you're doing this. All right, so now the next thing that I like to do is I drop down, and now sometimes I raise my heel up. Sometimes I have it planted flat on the ground. If you don't have as much ankle flexibility as I do, you might not be able to plant this flat on the ground. And that's why a lot of people's heels do come up. I don't care. We're not focusing on that. We're focusing on the hamstring, so the bottom or backside of the leg that's extended. Now when I do this, I like to put my hand, so if my right foot's out in front, my right hand goes off to the side for my balance, and my left one will reach, right? Again, I do this as a little bit of a dynamic stretch just by rocking my upper body forward, and I'll feel it activate, stretch those hamstrings, and then I back off. Activate, stretch those hamstrings, and I back off. This is more just a cue than anything else. It also can help me get a little bit of a stretch in my back whenever I'm doing this. Things to help you get even more of a stretch: pinch your shoulder blades together and then lean forward, right? You're gonna get a little bit more of a stretch because you're not just rounding your back, which is a pretty common thing people do when they're trying to touch their toes. Now let's go ahead and let's do the same thing onto the other side. So I don't even have to reach, right? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. If I reach with my chest though, I'm gonna get the stretch, and that's what's important. So again, dynamic movement. I'm going full range of motion and I'm coming back. I'm getting that full stretch in, and then I'm coming back. Now, if I wanted to gain more flexibility, I would have to do a static stretch where I held this position for at least 20 seconds, right? That's not the goal of this. I'm not trying to get that sort of a stretch in at this moment, right? Now from here, I've already stretched the front, I've stretched the inside, and then the back, right? So from here, I usually just go right down into the splits. That's one of the things I like to go into, right? Is go into your splits. So from here, you can do all toes up, right? Like I am right now. Both my toes are pointed up to the sky. You can make this dynamic by coming up and going down, coming up and going down. Again, slow, controlled motions. Then what I do is I come up, I put one hand over my leg. So now I put my right hand over my right leg. So now my right toes are up to the sky, and then I slide back down, right? My back leg is flat, where my back foot's flat, my right toes are up to the sky. Again, I can make this dynamic by adding a little bit of bouncing motion into it. Come up and go down. Now, if you can switch from one side to the other without coming up, good for you. I can't do that, all right? Get that stretch, just like this. All right, from here, you can come together and you can bounce, right? Or some of the time, what I'll end up doing is I'll just kind of hop around, and I like to do this, where I show the inside of my foot and I turn my hips. Show the inside of my foot, turn my hips. I call this a modified hip twist, all right? And I usually use this at about this pace, where I'm just kind of going, I'm getting that blood flow back into those legs, and I'm moving, right? My upper body's moving as well. From here, I like to grab and pull. So now this is gonna get the quads. You got a little bit of the quads when you did the hip flexor stretch, right? But you didn't get all of them, right? You didn't get down here. So when we do this, typically we're gonna stretch a little bit lower on the quads, versus up here, you get into the hip flexor and then the top part of the quads, which also does a hip flexion motion as well. And then do the same thing onto the other side. And then one more good one that I like to do is I spread the feet out a little ways, and I call these ones just regular hip twists, right? So I had my modified hip twist and my regular hip twist. Boom. And now I'm not really turning my heels or raising up. I'm just turning my hips. All right. From there, I can go back to modified hip twist. I usually like to do these ones right before I start kicking. Boom. Just kind of bouncing around, playing around with that, getting that blood flow. And then I'm ready to do my kicks. Now, you can stretch more of the upper body, but if you're just focusing on kicks for Taekwondo, you don't really need to stretch the arms a whole lot, right? You do throw the arms with kicks, but usually not at a velocity where you're gonna end up hurting yourself. Sometimes though, you might wanna get a little bit of a stretch in your sides in, right? So you might add something just like this in there as well. And the reason why you would add that is because whenever you start kicking, right? When you start kicking higher up, if you don't wanna drop your upper body down in order to get the high up kick, right? It means you're going to have to stretch one side in order to get it close to your leg, be able to hold that up, right? So whenever I do my kicks, unless I drop my body way down, I'm gonna feel a little bit of stretch there. So it is good to stretch that just a little bit, especially if you're kicking higher. If you're not kicking super high, well, you probably don't need to do that. So again, this is my routine, what I like to do in order to just feel ready to throw some kicks, and now I'm ready to throw some kicks. So go find a video where we're kicking and let's get to work.